begins, Avi. The laws of national mourning associated with this time period leading up to culminating with Tisha B'Av are modeled after the laws associated with the individual's mourning over the loss of a loved one. For instance, sitting on a low chair, for instance, restrictions on our activities, on leisure activities, on joyful activities. And the reason why this is so is because as much as there are specific details about how to mourn a loved one during Shiva and Shloshim, and for a parent, the first 12 months after their passing, there's also a motif. There's a theme, there's an overarching spirit, an attitude that we are supposed to adopt and internalize and understand and acknowledge when we are mourning both on an individual level for a loved one, and also on a national level for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the exile of the Jewish people, and all of the implications that are deleterious to us individually and nationally that emerge from that event. And the motif, the theme that is meant to be evoked through all of the actions, through all of the customs of mourning, is a sense of unsettledness, a sense of things are not normal, a sense that we are in an era, in a period that is unknown, uncertain, which evokes within us a sense of somewhat dread, a sense of anxiety and angst. This is what happens when we confront the loss of a loved one. This is what is meant to happen when we confront the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash on Tisha B'Av. And this feeling sometimes requires effort to evoke within us that it is not normal, the times that we live in without a Beit HaMikdash, that we should feel a sense of unsettledness, a sense of displacement. But of course, this year, those emotions and feelings are right on the surface for all of us, if not outpouring in our daily lives. A sense of unsettledness, a sense of displacement. How much more displaced can we be that instead of gathering together on Tisha B'Av night to recite and to hear Eicha and Kinnot, we are doing it individually, alone from our homes. It adds a level of poignancy to the statement that begins tonight's Megillah, Eicha Yashva Vadad. Whoa, how we sit alone. Who sits alone? Yerushalayim in the aftermath of the Chorban sat alone. The Jewish people in the aftermath of the exile sat alone. And here in Tafshin Pei Tisha B'Av, our beloved synagogue sits alone. And we individually sit alone, but nonetheless mourn together. Just as we will begin Eicha in a moment, and as is our custom, each of the chapters will be recited by a member of our community. But I'd like us to think of one other thought. In addition to the fact that a sense of displacement, a sense of unsettledness, and the realization that this is not normal, is perhaps easier for us to internalize this year. I'd like for us to also consider the fact that even when we are confronted with incredible challenges throughout the history of the Jewish people, God has provided for us the tools in order to persevere, in order to be resilient, in order to not only survive, but to thrive. In the aftermath of the destruction of the temple, there was a shift from, let's say, sacrificial service to prayer service. There was an emphasis on how the Torah comes with us, and the ritual observance of mitzvot can take the place temporarily for the rituals that are performed in the Beit HaMikdash. And even today, with the challenges of this health pandemic, the COVID crisis, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has provided for us tools that can help us persevere. Technology is at the top of that toolbox that God has granted us as a gift in order to maintain the bonds of connection and community. That being the case, we look forward to a 25 hours of meaning through Tisha B'Av, of relevance, of looking in the past, consulting, considering our current status, and with strength moving on into the future. We begin now with the recitation of Megillat Eicha in the various books that hopefully you have. I believe it will also be shared to the screen that we're on right now.
Eicha Yashvadad Ayi Rabati Amayeta Yamana Rabati Bagoyim Sarati Bamedinot Haeta Lamas Vochoti Beker Hada B'dimataha Alecheyaha Eilach Menachem Mikol Haveho Koreha Barduva Ayula V'yohevim Galata Yuda Meoni Umerov Avoda Hihi Yashva Bagoyim Lo Matzah Manoach Ko B'Godfeha Hisiguha Ben HaMetzarim Darchei Tzion Avelot Mibli Boy Moed Koshoreha Shomemim Kohaneha Nenachim Betuloteha Lugod Vehimalaha Hayutzareha Lerosh Oy Behashalu Yadonoi Hoga Aro Peshoeha Olaleha Holachushevi Nehitzahor Vaitzeni Batzion Kol Hadara Hayusareha Kayalim Lo Matu Bireh Ve'elchu B'lo Koach Lifnei Rodei Zochra Yerushalayim Yimei Aniyah Umrodeha Kol Machamudeha Asher Hayu Mimei Kedem Minfo Amach Biyatzar Yehiנו זר לה ועוצרים צחקו על משפטהו והתחתיה ירושלים על כן נדחייתה כל מכבדיה הזילוה קראו ערוותה גם היא נחבתה השלחה. טומאתה בשוליה, לא זכרה אחיותה, ותרף אלוהים, אין מנחם לה. יהיה אדוני את עוני, כי די לא יהיה. ידו פרצה על כל מחמדהו, כי ראתה גויים באו מקדשה, אשר ציווית לא יבוא לך. כל המנהיגים מבקשים לחם, נתנו מחמדיהם, ויאכל אשיב נפש. ויהי אדוני ויביטה, כי הייתי צוללה. לא עליכם כל עוברי דרך, הביטו וראו, אם יש מקום כי בחובי, אשר עולה לי, אשר הוגה אדוני ביום אחרון אפו, ממרום שלח איש בעצמותיו וירדנו. פרץ רשת רגלי, השיבון יכול, נתנני שוממה, כל היום דבר, נזכדו בשי, בידו הסתגרו, עלו הצבאי, הכשיר כוחי, התענני אדוני, בידי לא חכום. סלח כל אבירי אדוני בקרבי, חלי מועל לשמור בחורי. גד ארך אדוני, לתולת בת יהודה. על אלה אני בוכייה, איני ירדה מים, כי רחק ממני, מנחם משיב נפשי. היו בני שוממים, כי גבר אויב. פרסת ציון בידיה, אין מנחם לה. ציווה אדוני ליעקב סביבת צריו. הייתה ירושלים ונידה ביניהם. צדיקו אדוני כי פיהו מריתי. שמעונו כל העמים וראו מה טובי. בתולי ובחורי הלכו בשבי. קראתי למאווה הם ארימוני. כהני וזקני בעיר גברו. ביקשו אוכל עמו וישיבו את נפשם. וידעו כי צרים מהחומר מהרו. נפח ליבי בקרבי, כי מרום מריתי. מחוץ ששקלה חרב בבית המוות. שמעו כי ננחני. אין מנחם לי כל אויבי. שמעו אותי ששו כי אתה עשית. הבאתי יום קראת ויהיו כמוני. תבוא קוראתם לפניך ויעלה למו, כאשר עולת לי על כל פשעי, כי רבותיי נחותיי בליבי דברי.
Wally? No, that's Dave. Please bear with us a moment. We're just getting our next reader on audio.
Hello?
All right, you're good.
Are you good? Are you good?
Yeah, let's start and see how it goes.
Avi.
Well, if we hear you.
How about now?
We hear you. You can read. We don't see you, but it's okay. You can read.
Echo, Yoel, Yaakov Adonai Espasio, Ishlich Mishamayles, Tiferes Israel, Ozo Adon Adlo, Ato, Ilai Lochoma, Eis Konios Yaakov, Oras Kebros, Ifsrei Bas Yudo, Higyalor, Nel Mamlocho, Risor, Kodar Bochoria, Lo Keren Yisrael, Ishibo, Yemino, Bifyoye, Vayvar Yaakov, Keish Levabo, Ochlo, Sobi, Dora Kashto, Koye, Nisov Yemino, Kitso, Vayaruko, Makabat, Yohel Basio, Shofat Koyesh, Wasa, Oyo, Adonai Koye, Bila Yisrael, Bila Ko Amerosel, Shiches, Sogo. Adonai B'Tzion, Melech B'Shamos, Vayinas B'Zamapol, Melech B'Chovei. Zonach Adonai B'Zuchon, Yer Mikasho, Hizger V'Yaroyeh, Cholmos Adonose, Nasnuis Adonai, Ki Chokmol. Oshab Adonai Rashis Komas Vasio No Topko No Heshiv Yodo Vivare Belche Bechomo No Bumalu Tabu Vore Shoreho Ibad Vishibar Belicheho Alka Visore Abagoyim Eitor Gan Vieneho No Matsu Chazon, don't know. Yeshua Ores Yitmos Ekrebasia, Hello Afla Arosha, Agru Saki, Ovidu Loresha, Visulos Shalom. Kodu Mamos Nai, Chomanu Meya. Skivedi, Al Sheber Basani, Vehotefolel, Yodne, Irchovos, Kiryo, Imosam Yomru, Aye Dagan Vayoy, Bisatlam Kecholo Birchovosir, Vishapei Navshom, Elchei, Imosam. Moidech Moadam Elo Abbas Yerushalayim Moashvalach Vanachamei Visulas Basio Higodo Kayo Shivrei Meir Polo Diyayu Chazulach Shabbos Afem Logi log alonei, loishiv shusei, vayechazullah, masol shal, mahadu. Tzavkul, alayich apayim, kol obrei derech, sharku, vayenu yerosham, albas Yerushaloi, azahosai, sheyomru keli las yofi, Mosel Sechores Patul Alayach Bihem Kol Oyavayim Shorko Vayachar Kushay Amru Belon Ach Zehayom Shekevinu Motzonu Ra'id Asa Adonai Asher Zaman Pizza Emroso, Asher Tiva Bimekedem, Horas Olchomon, Aisamacholai Yechoye, Eirim, Yen Soroi, Toaklibom El Adonai, Chomas Batzio, Oridi Chanachal Yemo, Yomom Boailom, Al Tidni Fugas Lof, Altidom Basenech, Kumi Roni Valaylo, the Rosh Ashmuros, Shivchei Chamayim Libei, No Chape Adonai, Sei Elab Kapayim, Al Nefesh Layich, Atufim Berot, Berot Kol Chutzot. Adonai Babiton, Leolauta Ko, Intochalna, Noshim Periam, Molei Tipuchim, Imeorei, Midash Adonai, Kohei Benavi, Shavu, Lores Chutos, Nar Besokein, Sulosai Ubachurai, Noflu, Bechorei. Raktom Yom Apechom, Tofachto Chomoto, Dikro Chiam, Moed Gurai Misavim, Lovoyo, Yom Adonai, Podipesori, Asheti Bachibisi, Bechila.
אני הגבר רעני, בשבט עברתו, אותי נהג ויולך חושך ולא אור, אך בי ישב יהפוך ידו כל היום. בילה בשרי וארי, שיבר עצמותיי, בנה עליי ויקף ראש ותלאה, ובחשקים הושיבני כמתי עולם. גדר בעדי ולא אצא, הכביד נחשים, גם כי אזק ואשבה עם, סתם תפילתי, גדר דרכי בגזית, נתיבותי עיוום. דוב ערב הוא לי, הרי במסתרים, דרכי שורר, ויפשחני שמני שומעים, דרך קשתו ויציבני, המטרה לחץ. הבין וחיליתי בני אשפתם, הייתי שחור בכל המין, נגינתם כל היום, הסביעני ואמרורים, הרבני לנם. ויגרס בחצת שירי, הכפישני באפר, ותזנח משלום נפשי, נשיתי טובה, ואמר עבד נצחי, ותאכלתי מאדוני. זכרני ומרודי, לענב בראש, זכר תזכור, ותשוח עלי נפשי. זאת אשיב אל ליבי, על כן אוחיו. חסדי אדוני כי לא תמנו, כי לא חלו רחמיו, חדשים לבקרים, רבה אמונתך. חלקי אדוני אמרו נפשי, על כן אוחיו לו. טוב אדוני לקרוביו, לנפש תדרשנו, טוב יכיל ודומם, לתשובת אדוני, טוב לגבר כי ישאו בנעוריו. ישב בדודום כי נטל עליו, ייתן בעפר פיהו, אולי יש תקווה, ייתן למכהו לחי, יסבע בחרפה. כי לא יזנח לעולם אדוני, כי עמו גברי חם קרוב חסדיו, כי לא אינו מליבו, ויגע בני איש, ודרכי תחת רגליו, כל אסירי הארץ, להטות משפט גבר, נגד פני היום, לבית אדם בריבו, אדוני לא ראה. כי זה אמר ותהי, אדוני לא ציווה, מפי היום לא תצא, הרעות והטוב, מה יתונן אדם חי גבר על חטאיו. נח בסוף דרכינו ונחורם, ונשובה על אדוני, נישא לבבינו אל כפיים, אל בשמיים, אנחנו פשענו ומרינו, אתה לא סלחת. זכות ואף ותרדפנו, הרגת לא חמלת, זכות וענן לך מעבור תפילה, זכי ומעוז תשימנו בקרב העמים, פצעו עלינו פיהם כל אויבינו, פחד ופחד תהיה לנו השת והשבר, ספגי מים תרד עיני על שבר בתמים, איני נגרע ולא תדמה מעין הפוגות, עד ישכיב וירא אדוני בשמיים, איני עוד לא נפשי מכל בנות עירי. צודוני כציפור, אויבי חינם, צמתו בבור חיי, וידעו אבן בי, צפו מים על ראשי, אמרתי נגזרתי. קראתי שמך אדוני מבור תחתיות, קולי שמעת, אל תעלם אוזנך לרווחתי לשבתי, קרבת ביום אקראך, אמרת אל תירא. רבת אדוני ריבי נפשי גאלת חיי, Ra'ita Adonai Yavatati Shavta Mishpatim Ra'ita Kol Nikmatam Machshavotam Li Shamata Chepatam Adonai Machshavotam Alai Sivtei Komai V'Hegyonam Alai Kol Hayom Shivtam V'Kipatam Habita Ani Manginatam Tashiv lahem gemul Adonai k'maaseh yedeihem titen lahem meginat lev talatcha lam tirdof ba'afet hashmidaim mitachat shmei Adonai.
Eicha yuam zahav yishne haketem hatov tishtapechna avnei kodesh v'rosh kol chutzot b'nei tzion haikarim hamesulaim ba'apaz Eicha nechshavu lenivlei cheres maaseh yedei yotzer Gam tanim chaltzu shad, einiku gureyen, batami leachzar, kayenim bamidbar, davak lishon yonek, elchiko batzama, olalim shalu lechem, hores ein lahem. Ha'ochlim lamadanim nashamu b'chutzot ha'emunim alei tola chibku ashpatot vayigdal avon bat ami mechatat tzedom ha'afucha k'mo raga v'lo chalu v'yadayim zaku nezireha misheleg Tzachku mechalav, admu etzem mipninim, sapir gizratam, chashach mishchor taram, lo nikru b'chutzot, safad oram al atzmam, yavesh hayacha eitz, tovim hayu chalei cherev, Mechalei Rav Shehem Yazuvu Medukarim Mitnuvot Shaddai Yedei Nashim Rachamaniyot Bishlu Yaldeihen Hayu Levarot Lamo Vishever Bat Ami Kila Adonai Et Chamato Shafach charon apo, vayatzet eish b'tzion, vatochal yesodoteha, lo eminu malchei eretz, kol yoshvei tevel, ki yavot tzar v'oyev, b'sharei Yerushalayim, mechatot nevieha, Avonot kohaneha, hashofchim b'kirba, dam tzadikim. Na'u ivrim b'chutzot, negoalu ba'adam, v'lo yuchlu yigu bilbushehem, suru tamei, karu lama. Suru suru al tigao, kinatsu gamnao, amru bagayim, lo yosifu lagur. Hinei Adonai chilkam, lo yosif lahapitam. Hinei chohanim lo nasau, uzakenim lo chananu. Odeinu tichlena einenu, El Ezrateinu Havel, Betzipiateinu Tzipinu, El Goy Lo Yoshia, Tzadu Tzadenu, Milechet Birchavotenu, Karav Kitzeinu, Malu Yameinu, Kiva Kitzeinu, Kalim Hayu Rodveinu, Minishrei Shamayim, Al Harim Delakunu, Bamidbar Arvulanu, Ruach Hapeinu Meshiach Adonai, Nilkad Bishchitotam, Asher Amarnu, Betzilo Nichye Bagoyim, Sisi Vesimchi Bat Edom, Yoshevet Be'eretz Utz, Gam Alayich Tavor Kos, Tishkeri V'titari, Tam Avonech Bat Zion, Lo Yosif Lahaglotech, Hakad Avonech Bat Edom, Gila Al Chatotayich.
Zichar Adonai Mehayalanu, Habita Ur Estepasenu, Nachalaseinu Nefchalazarim, Batenu Linachrim, Yisomim Hayinu Vienna, Imosenu Ki Almanos, Meimenu Bichesef Shasinu, Eitzenu Bimichir Yavahu, Al Tzavarenu Nirdachnu, Yaganu Velohu Nachlanu, Mitzrayim Nasanu Yad, Ashur Lisbo Alachem, Avosenu Chatu Vienam, Dianachnu, Avosehem Savalnu, Avadim Mashluvanu, Horek Ein Miadam, Dinafshenu Navilachmenu, Mipnei Cherev Hamidbar, Orenu Kisanur Nichmaru, Mipnei Zalafos Ra'av, Nashim Bitzion Inu, Bisulos Biare Yehuda, Sarim Biadam Nislu, Pnei Zikenim Lo Nehedaru, Bachorim Tichon Nasa'u, Uniarim Ba'etz Kashalu, Zikenim Mishar Shavasu, Bachurim Minaginasam, Shavas Misos Libenu, Nepach Lievel Micholenu, Nafla Ateres Roshenu, Ainalanu Kichatanu, Alzeh Hayadave Libenu, Alele Chashchu Einenu, Al Hartion Sheshamein, Shualim Hilchuvo, Ata Adonai Liolam Teshev, Kis Acha Lidor Vador, Lama Lanetzach Tishkachenu, Tiazvenu Liorech Yamim.
Hashivenu Adonai Elecha V'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kekadem.
Hashivenu Adonai Elecha V'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kekadem. Ki Imaos Ma'astanu Katzata Aleinu Ad Me'od.
Hashivenu Adonai Elecha V'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kekadem.
Hashivenu Adonai Elecha V'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kekadem.
As we do, the evening continues with the recitation of Kinnot. We recite Kinnot both in the evening as well as in the morning. Much more extensive Kinnot will be recited as part of the morning service. And again, you'll be able to access a recording of some of the Kinnot with explanations starting at 7 a.m. There'll be an email that goes out with that information. And then live, Rabbi Freiberg and I will be explaining Kinnot beginning at 9:30 a.m. On the way you're watching tonight's program. Just to note a couple of things, and we'll recite the Kinnot with introductions interspersed by both myself and Rabbi Freiberg. The first Kinah of the night, written by Elazar Kalir, one of the most prolific liturgical poets, and yet we know very little about who he was. We're not even sure when he lived. Did he live in the 10th century, the 5th century, the 2nd century? Was he a witness to the Churban Beit HaMikdash? In some ways, it's one of history's mysteries. But on another perspective, not knowing when the historical Kalir may have lived is actually a good thing for us, because it highlights the timelessness of his message, of his sentiment. In this way, Kalir is all of us. He is responding to the Churban Beit HaMikdash, whether he experienced it firsthand or he is recalling it from 900 years later. His lessons, his pain, his eloquence captures the Jewish experience and our feelings even to this very day. The first Kinah that we recite, Zechor Hashem Hayalanu, many of the Kinnot you'll see play on the psukim from Megillat Eicha. Certainly this is from the 5th chapter, Zechor Hashem Hayalanu, and we ask Hashem to remember. It begins with Eicha's motif of mourning, but quickly switches gears to include an element of confession based on the Jewish concept, which we have in the Musaf Hamidah for Shalosh Regalim, Mipnei Chata'enu, Galinu Me'artzenu, that metaphysically there's cause and effect, and the cause of our exile, the cause of the Churban, is in fact shortcomings in our behavior and in our actions. The Mishnah in Avot says, Hevi mitunim badin, normally understood to mean be slow and deliberate to judge other people. But the Me'am Lois explains that this also applies bin Adam lamakom. Be slow to judge God's actions as somehow, God forbid, vengeful or spiteful. Understand that there is cause and effect, and that we, in fact, contribute to the absence of the Beit HaMikdash. This Kinah vacillates between these two perspectives. Tragedy happened because we as a people were negligent, lacking in some manner. And after vacillating between these two, the Kinah ends on a note of hope and optimism. Hashivenu in Eicha is the verse that we end Eicha on, even though it's the second to last verse. Our custom is to recite it even twice, where we say, Hashivenu Hashem Elecha, God come to us. And this verse stands in contrast to the pasuk in Malachi, chapter 3, verse 7, where the prophet quotes in the name of Hashem, Shuvu Elai, Vashuva Aleichem. There the prophet says, you Jewish people, take the first step of coming close back to God. And so the question remains, who is supposed to take the first step? Hashivenu Hashem Elecha? Are we waiting for God to make the first move? Or as the prophet Malachi says, Shuvu Elai, Vashuva Aleichem. First, we make the first move and Hashem will respond based on our effort. This actually was the very first Dvar Torah that I ever said in Hollywood, Florida, at a meet and greet at the home of Willie and Harriet Moses over 15 years ago when I came down for my interview Shabbos. And I said that idea, the conflict between these two psukim, who makes the first move? And the answer is, it's the delicate dance of tshuva. Tonight, our first reaction is to feel lost and helpless, as if only Hashem can help us. Hashivenu Hashem Elecha. It's true, but once we have the opportunity to continue to reflect and to read and to take some introspection, we realize that Shuvu Elai, that in the delicate dance, we can also make the first step. We can take the initiation and the initiative. We don't have to wait for God in order to mend that relationship, in order to build that Beit HaMikdash. Just to bring out one line In the art scroll, it's on page 48 in the art scroll Kinnot, where we say that Sinat Chinam Radafnu, we ran after Sinat Chinam. The idea that not only do we accidentally hate people, hate fellow Jews, God forbid, but we enjoy it, that we enjoy a good fight, Shalol L'Shem Shamayim. We have to be careful of that, as we know, one of the major sins that led to the destruction of the Second Temple was Sinat Chinam. We should run away from a fight. We should do our best in order to maintain and bring back peace, not to seek out a good fight, a good controversy. Zechor Hashem, Zechor Adonai V'Yayolanu. Oy, B'Torei Tzaddik V'Yayolanu. Nachazin Echor, Zermai, B'Tin Lachim, Oy, V'Yayolanu. Yitzom V'Yayim V'Yayim, Oy. Sinu V'Goros, Oy. V'Yayim V'Yayim V'Yayim, Oy. Kinizu V'Mayim Bazinu, Oy, V'Yayolanu. Oy. Zinas Chinam Radafnu. Oy, V'Yayolanu. Oy. Zinu V'Yayim V'Yayim, V'Yayolanu. Audi Mashlebanu, I Gilach of Matano, Mayalan, Machine of Lafayette, Vasa Mayani Adeno, Mayalan, Orin Kazan, Oi, Kilo of Galana Mir, Oi, Mayalan, Nashimizina, Oi, Gizani comes to a gozo, Mayalan, Mayalan, Oi, is so nice, Zane Majashabas, Oi, Timish Bat Yazama, you so, Mayalan, Joseph Ben, Oi, two other go later, Mayalan, another there's a chain, Oi, he's always a big shame. He knew why he know Hartzi owns your shop. Emoy, Arabies, Mashomi, my Malano. Ato Adonai Leolam Teshiv Kisachalodor Vador. Lama Lanata Tishkochenet Hazvin Archamim. Hashivenu and Alecha and Ashuva. Chadich Yamenu Kikadem. Kimos Masana Katzafta Lenu. Admaod. Hashivenu Adonai Alecha and Ashuva. Chadich Yamenu Kikadem.
Continue now with the next Kinah. We skip Kinah Bet. That's only said when Tisha B'Av falls on Motzei Shabbat. So we go on Kinah Gimel. We're in the art scroll on page 54, and we'll screen share it just a moment when we finish explaining it. This Kinah begins B'Layla Zeh Yivkayun. On this night, we weep and we wail. And this Kinah reflects and remembers the historical context in which Tisha B'Av falls. Right, we remember that what caused this night, obviously many things, but the first one was the Meraglim, the spies. Right, remember back in the Torah, 12 spies headed off to check out the land of Israel. Moshe wasn't so keen about this idea, but it happened. Much to discuss in terms of Parshanut for another time. But we're well familiar with this whole ordeal, and we know it did not go as planned. 10 of 12, the vast majority of the spies, came back with terrible reports. And the nation, again, Klal Yisrael, Am Yisrael, had the choice, right? 10 of 12 sinned, but the entire nation then had the choice whether to believe them or to ignore their reports and instead trust in the Haftachot, in the promises that Kadosh Baruch Hu, that God had given them so many times, and yet Lashon Hara reared its ugly head, and they believed, these 10 spies, they believed the report that the land that God had said was beautiful and bountiful was not. They chose to believe the Lashon Hara. They chose to believe these discouraging words about the land of Israel. And not only did they believe them, but they emotionally reacted to them. The people cried. And the Gemara in Ta'anit famously says that Hashem tells the Jewish people that since you cried for no reason that night, I, God, will decree or do decree that I will give you reason to cry on that night. And that night was the night of Tisha B'Av, and so the date, the 9th of Av, becomes a day of tragedies. Right, the first tragedy was right then in the Zman HaMidbar, those in the desert who thought they had traveled, they had left the slavery, they were hoping to get into the land of Israel to see this promised land, but no, they will never see it. They will die in the desert, and they will never enter Eretz Yisrael. We obviously know then throughout history, the first temple, the first Beit HaMikdash, the second Beit HaMikdash, were both destroyed on the same day. And finally, Bar Kokhba's revolt, I shouldn't say finally, fourthly, Bar Kokhba's revolt was stopped by the Romans. And Bar Kokhba's army lost their stronghold over the city of Beitar on this day of Tisha B'Av. And that was such a tremendous loss, such a gory battle that was lost, that the Gemara in Gittin records that so many Jews were killed that night that the Romans were able to take their blood and fertilize their gardens with it for 7 years. That's how much blood was lost. And the final thing we remember on this day of tragedies, and if you go through modern history, unfortunately, there's many more tragedies that happened on Tisha B'Av. But the classic fifth thing that we remember is Turnus Rufus, the Roman governor. He had Jerusalem razed and plowed over, as the Gemara in Ta'anit Kavav 26b describes. And so we read this Kinah, and it describes, it remembers, B'layla Zeyiv Kayun, that on this night we cried. With this cry, we cried tears of Kinah, we cried for no reason. And so then throughout history, unfortunately, we have been given way too many reasons to cry. Through much of the time, today, Rav Soloveitchik always said, Tisha B'Av is the day of national mourning. We were more things that happened throughout our history, not only things that happened on the 9th of Av, but unfortunately, we have way too many things that happen on this specific day. Never mind every other day that we can remember, we can mourn, we can think about, and we can try to improve on, so that we don't have to have this mournful day each and every year. We recite the Kinah Belel Zeyiv Kayun, Kinah Gimel. Pull it up on the screen in just a moment. Belel Zeyiv Kayun, V'yelin V'nai, Belel Zecharav Beis Mikachai, V'nesufu Hamonai, V'chol Beis Yisrael Yagu B'Donai, Yivku Asrei Fasher Surach Adonai, Belel Zetayel Maraniah, Nechteles Mibeis Aviyah B'chaim Mubdeles, Kiyapta Mibeis V'nizgar Deles V'hacha B'shivi V'chol Peh Ne'echeles, V'mshucha V'esh Bo'eres, V'ocheles Esh Im Kacheles, Yatsa Meis Adonai Belel Zeyiv Kayun, V'yelilin V'nai Belel Zeh Damasi B'chova, V'shal Gam Shnei Beisi Nechava, V'od L'ruchama V'asa Shaveva, V'shkat Savei Rosh V'espit Natzava, V'shucha Mibeis V'gam Nesh Satova, Gedol Asina Meis Asher Aheva. Loze Kadati Chashu Ma'aras, Chur B'meis Yamid V'mishmaros, Loze Zmana V'nitaras Adam Kama B'dim Chamash Nazaros, Chichinam Bachu Niv Kaladoras, Yan Kiais Asiva Me'adonai Loze Karnu V'nai, Loze Ruvach HaMeshmaros, Kazar Kum Ki Zayom Asher Amar Adonai. Continue now with the next Kinah. Next Kinah we'll read is Kinah Daled for Shomron. And the Kinah Shomron Kol Titen. This Kinah depicts horrible imagery is used in this Kinah. This Kinah is really a reflection, almost a parallel of the parak of Tanakh, of a parak of Yechezkel, parak Kaf Gimel, chapter 23. And there a mashal, an imagery is drawn of two sisters. The pasuk there reads, Ushmotan Aholah Hagdolah, the Oholiva Achotah. There's two sisters. The elder one is named Oholah, and her sister Oholiva. That's the younger sister. And what's described there is that these two sisters were quite promiscuous. And in fact, they were married to the same man, which we know is not permitted. And then the Navi explains that these two sisters represent two different parts of the land of Israel. Oholah represents Shomron, the northern kingdom of Israel, which contained the 10 tribes. And her sister Oholiva represents the southern kingdom, which is also known as the kingdom of Yehuda. And that contains Yerushalayim and the final two tribes, the tribe of Yehuda and the tribe of Binyamin. As we mentioned, both are married to one husband. And in the analogy, these 10 tribes and these 2 tribes, they're both supposed to be married to God. The entire Jewish people is supposed to be married to God. And yet, just like these 2 sisters betrayed each other and betrayed their husband, both the 2 tribes in the south and the 10 tribes in the north actively betrayed God. In both names, in fact, both the names of the sisters, the name Oholah and the name Oholiva, have the same shorish of the same root. They both come from the root tent, right, or ohel, representing the home, the place where we're supposed to have marital sanctity. And we see that that was defiled and was not the case in this situation. Both sisters were not faithful, just as both sets of tribes, 10 on the north and 2 on the south, all served idols and were not faithful to God. The author of this Kinah is Rav Shlomo ibn Gabriel. Rav Shlomo lived in Spain in the 11th century, and he writes the Kinah from the perspective of these 2 kingdoms, of the 10 in the north, right, this northern kingdom and the southern kingdom in the south, that Shomron and Yehudah are arguing with each other. And they're both claiming that they suffered a greater defeat by their enemies than the other. They both claim they were hurt more, that they were trampled upon more, that they got hurt more than the other. But we know that it doesn't matter who got hurt more. It doesn't matter who suffered more. At the end of the day, both suffered. All were exiled. Many, many were killed. And from this tragedy, many more tragedies occurred. And unfortunately, they continue to occur to our people. We mourn that the destruction of Eretz Yisrael, both the temple and then finally the galus of all 12 tribes, northern and southern. And we mourn much more than that on this evening. Continue with Shomron, Kinah number 4. Pull it up on the screen in just a moment. Shomron kol tizen matzuni avonai, la'eret acheret tatzuni vanai. V'holiva tizak v'nisru amonai, v'tomar tzion ozavni Adonai. Allah ha'holivacha shevanai chania, yisma shelicha lechashi v'lechania. Ani Allah suya v'gadi 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 Nekali amir shalom dinati, tiglas v'nadi achad nevi, hamadi v'shavet dinati, lachla chacha v'nazaz mimi, yalei babati pidi kipchi, shnasai chacha v'lai chushanai, levat tizak v'nisir amonai, tmatzion Adonai Adonai, mashiv alani chanai shashasi, alif nor v'hala v'nadi, ahir v'nadi, ta'adach asvabot nadi, Nisrafin chalasher ba'anich monadi l'shiri gav'avavavadi Shavdi zanalecha adadi gamzot ba'ma'adam adi adavani adam b'mogavani Adadi adadi Chamalada chamalada l'sam Resh mazam recha b'sam Al tiktav ad na'ad resh b'sam Al adi zarlam Banas shivra menachem Avalusam tiata sevata Yadisam chadesh yemenu t'mei kadmonai K'na'amecha b'nei Yerushalayim Adonai.
There's one more Kinah as part of the regular service, and then we conclude with the Kinah lamenting the Holocaust written by Rav Schwab. The last of the Kinnot that are part of the traditional service begins Ad Ana B'chiyah B'Tzion U'Misped B'Yerushalayim. Kinah number 5, listed in the evening keynote. This Kinah discusses how the Churban was not just an event on a national or a religious or ethnic level. It was a tragedy of cosmic significance. Va'af mazalot yizlu dima. Even the signs of the zodiac shed a tear and mourn the destruction. I would take it one step further based on an idea that I heard yesterday, that the Churban upended the world order. Mekalkelet et hashura. Rav David Stav, who is the founder of the Tzohar rabbinic organization in Israel, gave a shir yesterday via Zoom, and he quoted this Maimar Chazal, I forget exactly where it is, in our traditional texts that talk about three rabbis discussing what it is about the Beit HaMikdash that they miss the most. One of the rabbis said that they miss a good hot bath. Ever since the destruction of the temple, he hasn't been able to find a good hot bath. Another one says that he misses the finely tailored clothing that were available in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. And the third rabbi says that he misses the aesthetic beauty, that people are not as beautiful as they were in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. And asked Rav Stav, how do we understand this statement, this story from Chazal? When we think about what we're missing in the temple, baths and clothes and beauty, beautiful people are not what we think about. We think about Karbanot. We think about Aliyah L'Regel. We think about Kohanim. We think about Simchat Beit HaShoeva. So what exactly is this statement, this story of Chazal teaching us? And so what Rav Stav explained is that what we really miss about the Beit HaMikdash was the attitude, was the perspective on life that we were able to inculcate within ourselves as a result of the existence of the temple. We miss living integrated, holistic lives. What do I mean by that? Well, today our lives are bifurcated for the most part. We distinguish between Kodesh and Chol, between sacred and profane, between what we do as part of our religious lives and what we do as part of our normal everyday lives. And of course, that is not the ideal, to live sort of this schizophrenic existence, this bifurcated existence. Rather, we were meant to strive to live integrated lives, whereby everything we do is understood to be part and parcel of our Avodat Hashem. And that's the attitude that existed in the Beit HaMikdash. Right? So that's what the rabbis were saying. Yeah, there are baths and there's beauty and there's fine clothing, but nowadays we don't understand how each of those things can and must be part and parcel of our integrated selves as Avdei Hashem, that all of these things are part of the service of God. Remember, in the times of the Beit HaMikdash, we had a Beit HaMikdash, but there weren't any shuls. An important point to make this year especially. Jews went to the Beit HaMikdash to be inspired. The existence of the Beit HaMikdash regulated all of their lives. Certainly they prayed in that direction when they did, not in a shul though. And if they were farmers, as was much of society agriculturally based, they would think about the Beit HaMikdash at every point as they were developing, preparing for, and harvesting their crop. The gifts that went to the Kohanim, the first fruits that came as Bikurim, everything that they did when they got up in the morning and they fertilized their fields, they understood that that was part and parcel of what it means to be a God-fearing Jew. And that attitude has been lost in the aftermath of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, where everywhere you go and everything you do is understood to be part of our Avodat Hashem. We can get there. And certainly in this absence that many of us have experienced from a shul, perhaps has given us the strength and the realization that we need shuls to inspire us as the Mikdash Ma'at. We need shuls as a focus of community, but we also have the strength and the resolve to live richly Jewish lives in our homes, in everywhere, in every situation that we're in. And that's what we're striving for, and that has become that much more difficult in the aftermath of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which was, as we said, a cosmic event that upended that perspective and that world order. As is our custom, we will conclude, before we say the psukim that we conclude Kinnot with, we will conclude by reciting together the Kinah composed by Rav Shimon Schwab, the Kinah that mourns the destruction that took place within this century, this past 100 years. Even less than that. We have eyewitnesses that still continue to exist, survivors of the Churban Europa, the destruction of European Jewry by the Nazis during the Holocaust. It's in the Art Scroll Siddur on page 386, and it's also in the Koran that we will put up on the screen. We very much commemorate the Holocaust. It's a living event for us. In ways that only an event of the past 75, 80 years could be. And we pride ourselves in a Yom HaShoah program and honoring our survivors and the children of survivors, and now the third generation, grandchildren of survivors, to never forget, to remember their stories, to make sure that it impacts who we are as Jews, and that we take that lesson forward. It's also important to note that anti-Semitism and hatred for Jews and what Judaism stands for is not new, right? The images that we'll talk about tomorrow of Titus stabbing the parochet as he entered the Holy of Holies is not because he hated Jews, but it's because he hated what Judaism stood for in the pagan world, the idea of monotheism, the idea of objective morality. These were hated ideas by Titus, and 2,000 years later by Hitler as well. And so we connect the tragedies throughout history in this very poignant way by reciting this Kinah as the very last one that we will read this evening, to give us resolve to never forget, whether it's never forget Churban Yerushalayim, never forget Churban Europa. We'll say it together. Hazocher Maskirav Dor Dor Kedoshav Beit Asher Az Bachartanu Yizkor Diraon Shal Dor Acharon Oya Mehayalanu Shtuvim Abul Dam Shemasrun Afshosam Kol Shkuim Keabacha Yifkedem Elohim Bartzos HaChayim Badei Ad Zichram Livracha Sui Lav Kapayim Ahai Shamayim Hoya Meitav Shivtei Yisrael Edosu Kilos Arim Glilos Chavros Mosados Komo Adeel Mi Tain Palgimayim Tirad Neinayim El Ashtos Nachlei Hadmaos Alei Alfei Alafim Gufim Nisrafim B'moesh HaChurban Uzvaos V'al Sarei HaTorah Machzikei Mesorah V'al Pirchei HaKuna Tzirim V'al Chovshei Midrashos Umorim Umoros Tinokosh Beis Rabban Yakirim Al Banos Vodchos V'Savim V'Savos V'al Zaram V'Tapam She'eladu V'gam L'Rabos Rivos Nehavim B'Chayim B'Mosam Al Lo Nifradu Estamam Derosh Kisisas Rosh Shal Kol Nidaf L'Alim HaTrufim Kol Nafshos Meis B'Mei Shever V'Shes Shisha Alfei Pamim Alafim Shlishi El V'er Bivrak Zam V'Soer Mikarmei Achemed Ahavta Goel Adam Nazecher Tzaram Al Timchem Yisefer Kasafta Zechor Anakos V'Rash Tzakos Az Yuvlu L'Retzach Ye'orei D'Mehem V'Dimos B'Neihem Lo Sishachachna L'Netzach Kol Chil Ugnicha Nihi Tzricha Mishtudei Lahakos HaKlavim Zechor Usmor Menod Chatzror Ad Eis Nikom Elbon Aluvim B'machanos HaPra'im Keiv Unegaim Upachin Nefashos Agumos Charafos Utzchok Klimos Varok Pitzei Hakaos Ayumos Uravon Timaon Shigaon Itzavon Chishlon Echshalim B'li Koach Kol nakos chalal mikol yachidum lal, chalila lacham lishkoach. Sim Rosh Hashan, Rikitor Mikivshan, Tilei Tilim, Atzamos Migidim, Chadrei Aral, Kol Shagos Mikal, Hanechnakim Toch Ta'i Ha'idim. Sirchon Gufos, Ugvios Gufos, Glal Domen Admas Noatzim, Eich Hafchu Torfehem, Livoris Chalvehem, or Ishli Kushei Te Anashim. Ukrisatz Atzabos Shel Rashi Apraos, Limin Shibud Perach, Tzamavis Lismol, Ve'ech Yoru Yurios Al Chofrei Aboros, B'Yisrei Chibut Kever, Horidum Sha'ol. Ech inu ach yosenu es arsu benosenu, kosos tarela midei rofim achzorim, ufliteas ridim mechilosu starim, v'timyon yeladim b'vatei shmad kamarim. Se tamim leola, dam b'nei agola, hoy Ariel b'nivlas chasidecha, tzon kadashim yimneh, sherisham lo sichbeh, b'chunecha hayu mekadshe shemecha. B'kol Shema Yisrael, Masru Nefesh Le'el, Shehu Yasveim B'ad Yom Acharon, Hitziku Din B'afanim Amin Anu, Sharu Shiras Bitachon. Chen Yishar Am, Ki Yasom Nitam, B'li Kvarim L'shtateach, V'lo Matzevos Efo Livkos, Yevavos Levav Vroseach. Rak Nizchei Adam Az Karosam, Tosasim B'li Shocheach, V'rei Afrei Akedasam, Trumos Tishnei Mizbeach. Miyamalel Tzar Yisrael, Shardaito Mikev Nitrefes, Usheris HaPe'er, Kimat Mizer, Ve'ech Komasa, Hayom Nichvefes. El Chaim Rachem, Adaschan Achem, Shelacham O Nichsefes, Or Chadosh Tazriach, Karneho Tatzmiach, Veruach Elohim Merachefes. Terachim Siyom Kasher Mata, V'tochoner Kasher Dibarta, Tamer Yeshua V'sachish Gula, Sofi Yerushalayim Rachamim Rabim. Kakasula and the Viachalachin Komar Adonai, Shaft Yerushalayim Rachamim, Basi Vaneba, Numad Nightvos, Communal Yerushalayim Venemar, or Krali Mor Komar Nightvos, Otufutzeno, Remito Vinicham Adonai, Odes Sion of Bachar, Od Yerushalayim, Ganamar, Kinicham Anaition, Nicham Kalkovasa, Yasim Midbar Kedem Arasaki Gan Adonai, Sason Vesimcha Yamativa, Toda Vikol Zimra. We'll now conclude with the paragraph of V'ata Kadosh, as is done Motzei Shabbat, and also the paragraph in Uval Tzion. We begin with V'ata Kadosh. We won't be able to say Kaddish and Aleinu after that. We did that in Shul earlier, but we will conclude with V'ata Kadosh. Before we do, and we'll conclude with the V'ata Kadosh, just a reminder that Shacharit is available via Zoom at 8:30 a.m. tomorrow from the yh.org/vtorah webpage. You can access the events that are always the davening, which is always tomorrow morning. We're offering special at 8:30 Shacharit via Zoom, and then at 9:30 come back to the link that you utilized to view tonight. At which time Rabbi Freiberg and I will be spending some time explaining Kinnot, introducing Kinnot, as we did this evening, doing about 9 or 10 Kinnot together, and you'll be receiving an email tomorrow morning with a recording. If you're not available at 9:30 to see it live, there'll be a recording of other Kinnot that I prepared earlier today for your viewing at any time over the course of Tisha B'Av. Adonai chavetz l'man tzidko, yagdil Torah v'yadir. Wishing everyone a healthy and meaningful Tisha B'Av experience. You can go to yh.org/Tisha B'Av or access it from the homepage for all of the details of the programming. In addition to Shacharit and Kinnot in the morning, there's a full array of options and opportunities for all ages, adults, and some programming for children as well. Take a look at that page, yh.org/Tisha B'Av.